Listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm your host, Garland Nixon. The U.S. empire is facing unrelenting internal opposition to its policies in Israel, and congressional hawks are setting up mechanisms to control future protests before they start. Joining us to discuss this and more, we've got Dr. Gerald Horne, professor of history at the University of Houston in Texas. He's an author, historian, and researcher. Dr. Horne, welcome back to the Critical Hour.
Thank you for inviting me.
A bill introduced in the House of Representatives would create anti-Semitism monitors at colleges funded by the U.S. federal government, a reaction to widespread pro-Palestinian demonstrations that have falsely been labeled anti-Semitic. And, of course, the colleges that don't go along with the government's game could lose federal funding. Your thoughts on this, Dr. Horne?
Well, it's obviously ludicrous and ridiculous. And look at who are carrying this particular piece of so-called legislation. I'm referring to Congressman Richie Torres of the Bronx, who is a favorite of the neoconservative columnists of the New York Times, speaking of Brett Stevens, who, of course, has been in the vanguard of disparaging protests at neighboring Columbia University. I'm speaking of Congressman Mike Lawler, also of New York State. Recall that this Republican defeated Sean Patrick Maloney, who had been leading the Democratic Congressional Fundraising Committee and obviously was inattentive to his duties and was defeated, his duties as a congressman, that is, and that opened a vacuum that Lawler filled, and now he's up for re-election in November. He is slated to go down in defeat, so now he's trawling for campaign donations from Zionist and pro-Israeli billionaires, and voila, you have this particular piece of demagogic legislation. It's also a capitulation to a double standard. One would not know from looking at this particular piece of legislation that Black students in particular have been complaining for years about harassment on campus. But what our students are told is that they need to buck up, stiffen their spines, don't be a snowflake, and proceed on. Whereas these pro-Zionist students, there's even been calls for the National Guard to be entering campuses, supposedly to protect them. And we know that that is a dangerous proposal because when these weekend warriors, known as the National Guard, came onto the Kent State campus in Ohio some decades ago, they left behind a rampage, not to mention at students. But fundamentally, this legislation and the brouhaha about the alleged harassment of pro-Zionist students represents a profound misreading of what used to be called the Jewish question. What I mean is anti-Semitism, to be clear, anti-Jewish fervor is a problem in the United States and has been historically. You need look no further to what is oftentimes covered up. I direct your audience to the anti-Jewish statements of founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin. Speaking of the latter, I doubt if the HBO docudrama starring Michael Douglas as Franklin dealt with this, I'm afraid to say. However, having said that, it's an error. It's a profound error to equate what has befallen Jewish people in the United States with what has befallen Jewish people in Europe. And indeed, what happens is that the so-called Mizrahi in Israel, the Jewish folk with roots from Morocco to Iraq, they make the same statement. They make the same evaluation, which is that it's a mistake to take the 500-year history leading from the Inquisition in the late 1400s up until the Holocaust concluding in 1945, which was a European phenomenon, and try to paste that on to Jewish experiences worldwide. That inevitably leads to blunders, it inevitably leads to misestimates, and it inevitably leads to this kind of wrong-headed legislation that you are witnessing in Congress today. Because in the United States, the Jewish community was integrated into a larger so-called white community because that elite population, speaking of Jefferson, Franklin, and all the rest, they needed all the bodies that they could muster to subdue the indigenous and to keep the enslaved Africans in line. And so that opened up opportunities for the Jewish community in North America that they had not known in Europe. In fact, I have a book coming out in a few days on the Southern California experience, and it's interesting to note, because I think it's illustrative, that the first non-Mexican settler in San Diego was a Jewish man who had a reputation as a so-called Indian fighter. And I think that sums up, in some ways, that particular experience of Jewish Americans in North America. And of course, if you look historically at Congress, at a time when Jewish Americans were being treated like trash in Europe, you had Senator Yulee of Florida, a pro-slavery legislator in Washington pre-1861. You had Judah Benjamin of Louisiana, the number 2 or number 3 in command of the so-called Confederate States of America. And of course, both Yulee and Benjamin happen to be Jewish. And of course, to fast forward to today, we see their descendants in terms of Bill Ackman of Pershing Capital, who helped to rout Claudine Gay at Harvard, the first Black woman president. He, of course, happens to be of Jewish ancestry, as has been the case, or as is the case for Haim Saban of Los Angeles, a Hollywood mogul, a big supporter of Mr. Biden. And so I think that it's well past time to try to gain an accurate analysis of what's going on, because if we don't have an accurate analysis, it seems to me we'll inevitably wind up with the kind of ludicrous legislation that we have begun to discuss.
Here's an interesting article. It comes from interesting for a number of reasons. It comes from the New York Daily News. Gaza protests threaten to upend Democratic convention in Chicago amid growing criticism of Biden. That's a pretty good ways out. And I'll add in this. Do you think that the ruling elite have a fear that these could also morph into anti-imperialist or an economic movement in light of the fact that these students are facing a very bleak economic future if they come together, start pushing back against the system? Let's say for whatever reason, it's the eventuality is this is over or whatever happens, that they don't walk away, that they now say, well, wait a minute. You've screwed up our future. We still got a bone to pick with the ruling elite. Your thoughts on that in the Democratic convention, Dr. Horne?
Well, with regard to the Democratic convention, there are certainly echoes and reverberations of 1968 that we see rolling into Chicago. You recall that in 1968 in Chicago, Mayor Daley unleashed his jackbooted police thugs who crashed heads and bloodied heads on camera, transmitting images of a police force running amok all over the world during a time when the United States was already under assault because of the genocidal conflict in Vietnam. Obviously, there are parallels today, but one parallel, fortunately, that is not present is that today you have a mayor of Chicago, Brandon Johnson, who I would dare say is not walking in the footsteps of the late Mayor Daley. And hopefully that will be enough, along with a mobilized population, to keep heads from being cracked in Chicago in a few months. At the same time, of course, we do see that bubbling up from the grassroots are protests about Mr. Biden, oftentimes derided as Genocide Joe. He's been authorized to be the commencement speaker at Morehouse College, the historically Black college in Atlanta, the alma mater of Dr. King, of Samuel L. Jackson, of Spike Lee, amongst others. Students are up in arms about that protest, about his arrival and plan to protest. Many, including myself, are upset with Mr. Biden because he recently referred to our Melanesian brothers and sisters. These are the indigenous people of the Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea, who, believe it or not, could resemble Africans if you saw them walking down the street. He referred to them as, quote, cannibals, unquote, telling a likely apocryphal story about how an uncle of his supposedly was consumed by these alleged cannibals when he was forced down in that territory. I think that is very disturbing. It betrays and bespeaks a very demented attitude towards the populations of melanin enrichment. But at the same time, of course, I think students are understandably concerned not only about what I've just mentioned, but also about what's unfolding on Columbia University's campus as we speak. That is to say, mass suspensions. I think that President Shafiq, who has roots in Egypt and served time in London, was ill-served by her advisors, who suggested that she unleashed the police on campus a few days ago. She must not have known that in police departments, not least in New York, there's this right-wing populist trend, which is supposedly anti-elitist, and these police officers manifest that trend by seeking to bash the heads of students from these so-called elite campuses whenever they have the opportunity. But it's not just Columbia. I just received a report that at UCLA, where there's also an encampment, there have been mice released at the encampment. That is very dangerous. There's no telling what kind of bacteria these mice were carrying. It's of a piece with what happened in Columbia just a few weeks ago, when there was chemical spray sprayed on to the protesters. We saw at Emory University in Atlanta, professors, including women professors, being roughhoused. We see that at the University of Texas at Austin, you had cops on horses heckling protesters. It looked like there was a scene from Odessa from 1905. But fortunately, the good news is that United Auto Workers has come out for a ceasefire. The LA County Federation of Labor has come out for a ceasefire. We see that Congresswoman Summer Lee of the Congressional Black Caucus, a stalwart of the pro-encampment movement and of the pro-ceasefire demand, she was able to beat back a primary challenge by double digits. But at the same time, we must continue to be on our guard. Look at the New York Times this morning. Congresswoman Omar of Minnesota being derided because she says that all Jewish students should be supported, be they anti-genocide or pro-genocide. And of course, that was seen as overly provocative, even though an International Court of Justice says that a plausible case for genocide has been made out in historic Palestine. So this movement is spreading. It's spread to Paris, where you have demonstrations and encampments at the Sorbonne. And of course, we will stand firm until the students overcome.
Dr. Gerald Horne is a professor of history at the University of Houston in Texas. He's an author, historian, a researcher, and a friend of the show. And by the way, he's got more than 24 books out. My favorite one, of course, being the book about the great Paul Robeson.